exactly like their forebears from the Second World War, heck, going back to the Civil War, that this is the future leadership of the country. In the corporate world, political leaders, public sector leaders, this is who you want to hire, is my objective in all this. Somewhere along the line, this, again, you can call it an Oliver Stone narrative if you like, hijacked it is, man, combat just screws you up, period. No good can come of it, is the Oliver Stone narrative, right? So that hijacking is something that we're trying to take back. And I'm looking forward to the afternoon's conversation. I'm looking forward to, and I've had a lot of sidebar conversations with individuals throughout this. Any thoughts, any ideas, again, based on your hard-earned lessons over the span of your lives, professional lives, that we can incorporate into this new message going forward, I would absolutely love to hear that. So, without any further ado, I'll get to the two people this afternoon, at least on this panel, that you most want to see. I'm going to introduce the first one. That's Professor George Herring. Professor Herring is a native of the Commonwealth of Virginia, was educated primarily here, earning his undergraduate and master's degree at Roanoke College and his PhD from the University of Virginia. He served in the U.S. Navy prior to enrolling at UVA, which his first faculty appointment it was in 1965 with Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. 4 years later, Professor Herring joined the faculty at Kentucky, where he directed the work of 35 PhD students across the span of his career. He's also served as a visiting professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the University of Richmond. He specializes specifically in the history of U.S. foreign relations. His writing is focused on the Vietnam War. The centerpiece of his work, America's Longest War, the United States and Vietnam, 1950 to 1975, is now in its 5th edition. His 2008 treatise, From Colony to Superpower, U.S. Foreign Relations Since 1976, received the 2008 Robert Farrell Award from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Over the years, Professor Herring has received fellowship support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Fulbright and Guggenheim Foundations. So, Professor Herring.
I think in the haste to get me up here and get my predecessor off, we didn't give him the round of applause yet. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Virginia. Every time I step inside the state line, I step a little more lightly and feel a little stronger. It's a great honor. I'm honored and humbled to have the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon about a war that I have studied for 40 years, plus with people who served in that war with honor and distinction. My task is an easy one. I have been tasked to sort of give you an overview of the Tet Offensive and talk about what it was and how it came into being, how it ended, how it changed the war, and to do that in 20 minutes or less. Let me begin by taking the war back to late 1967. By this time, the United States had been at war in Vietnam for 3 years. Close to 500,000 troops in Vietnam. In 1967 alone, it suffered 9,000 plus killed in action, almost double the toll of 1966. Yet in the eyes of many observers and in the hearts of others, all that seemed to have been achieved was a stalemate. And as the cost in blood and treasure rose and victory remained elusive, public support began summer and fall of 1967 to drop sharply, and opposition to the war heightened. So the obvious question is what to do. And on the military side, there were proposals to expand the war, to escalate by increasing the bombing significantly and by moving into Laos and Cambodia, perhaps even across the DMZ into North Vietnam. On the other hand, by this time, Robert McNamara is come to the point of urging an outright policy of disengagement. Lyndon Johnson, who always seems to seek the middle instead of going for strong proposals one way or the other, instead of any of these things, Johnson proposes an intensive public relations campaign with the object of persuading an increasingly skeptical public that the United States is, in fact, winning the war. This success campaign, as I think was pointed out this morning, achieved some success. By the end of 1967, support for the war and for the president's conduct of it rose measurably, and this is sort of the backstory for Tet. Then on January 31st, 1968, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched an offensive unprecedented in its scope and very, very different in its focus. It occurred during Tet, the most festive of Vietnamese holidays, a time of family gatherings, of week-long celebrations, when everything sort of comes to a halt. The attacks were nationwide, extending from the DMZ to the Kamau Peninsula. In all, the enemy struck 36 of 44 provincial capitals, 5 of 6 major cities, 64 district capitals, 50 hamlets. Now, for top U.S. policymakers, I think it goes without saying that the Tet Offensive was outright alarming. Keep in mind that it occurred just a week after the North Koreans seized the spy ship Pueblo and its crew, which suggested that the communists might be opening a second front, perhaps, in Korea. Intelligence reports suggested the possibilities of flare-ups in Berlin and the Middle East. Also important to keep in mind that Tet took place during a time of economic crisis, the worst, some people say the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression for the United States and its European allies, something that's not often mentioned but is very important in terms of U.S. decision-making. Now, the first question to ask is, why did North Vietnam, and Hanoi did make the decisions about that, there's no issue, why did North Vietnam take such risk with a bold, possibly disastrous gambit of this sort? Not an easy question to answer, obviously. There is no Freedom of Information Act in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. At this time, very little archival material is available to scholars, Vietnamese or American. The best answer that can be gleaned from what is available is that Hanoi hoped, by doing something of this magnitude, to break the stalemate, change the balance of forces in its favor, and perhaps even end the war. Tet does not seem to have been an act of desperation, as some U.S. officials claimed at the time, nor was it born of excessive optimism. It's usually been attributed to President Ho Chi Minh, General Vo Nguyen Giap. Recent research makes clear that it was the brainchild of Communist Party First Secretary Le Duan, himself a Southerner, a firebrand, a hardliner, absolutely committed to total victory in the war. Ho and Giap, in fact, had opposed some of the elements of Tet. They preferred a more cautious, protracted war strategy. They were out of the country, maybe in exile, while the final planning for Tet took place. Now, what did Le Duan and his colleagues hope to achieve? First, by launching attacks against the cities and towns, they sought to rock the Saigon government to its foundations and ignite a general uprising, an outright rebellion among the people of South Vietnam that might perhaps knock South Vietnam out of the war. Like all of North Vietnam's major offensives, look at the dates, 1964, 1968, 1972. No coincidences here. All of them took place in American election years. Obviously, Hanoi also hoped to take advantage of Tet to shake the will of the United States, perhaps stir further divisions within the among Americans themselves, maybe drive a wedge between the United States and its ally, South Vietnam. The offensive started with a series of late 67 diversionary attacks, which have been mentioned in various forms this morning. A series of attacks scattered across the country, the hope of which was to lure U.S. forces away from the cities, where the cities would then be vulnerable to attack in February 1968. So Con Thien, Lac Ninh, Song Bay, Dak To, and of course Khe Sanh, a battle legendary for the Marine Corps. Tet works as planned, or as the North Vietnamese hoped, but only to a point. The United States was surprised by the attack. Although there was lots of evidence that something big was going to happen, nobody really picked up on the idea that this was going to be in the cities or exactly during Tet. But there were problems here. Some enemy units attacked before they were supposed to, jumped the gun, differences in the calendar or mistakes in the calendar. This gave the Americans and the South Vietnamese some warning at least, and made it possible for a much, much stronger U.S.-South Vietnamese response. The other thing they underestimated was U.S. mobility, which enabled the United States Command to get troops from one area to the other much more quickly, and therefore turn the action around. Thus, across South Vietnam, the VC scored initial gains, only to be driven back by U.S. and ARVN forces at huge cost. There was no general uprising, as the Hanoi leadership had hoped. Rather, South Vietnamese rallied around the government. The ARVN did not collapse. Rather, it fought better than Americans might have expected or dared predict. The NLF bore the brunt of the Tet attacks, suffered enormous losses from which it would never entirely recover. And more after Tet, North Vietnamese regulars assumed the burden of the fighting. Yet, if in these terms Tet represented a military defeat for the enemy, it was still a costly victory for the United States and South Vietnam. ARVN forces withdrew from the countryside to defend the cities, meaning that the limited progress that had been made in pacification from 66-67 came to a halt. The massive destruction of the cities heaped new problems on a government that had not shown itself able to deal with routine in the past. And there were heavy losses on the Allied side as well. In the first 2 weeks of Tet, the United States lost 1,100 killed in action, South Vietnam 2,300. The fighting caused huge civilian deaths, created roughly 1 million new refugees, and staggering new problems that had to be dealt with. And so here, to try to get a short assessment, is in much of the war, there was a great deal of destruction and suffering, but no clear-cut winner or loser. Obviously, also, to the extent that Tet was planned to influence the United States, it succeeded. It set loose instant shockwaves across the nation. It did not turn the American people against the war. That had already happened. The shift was already underway in the summer-fall of '67. Indeed, the impact of Tet is much more pronounced because of Johnson's success campaign. All fall and into the winter, Americans had been told, we are winning, we are winning. The obvious question then at Tet was, if we were winning, how could an enemy on the verge of defeat mount an offensive of this scope and magnitude and severity? It put the lie to the official optimism. What the hell is going on, TV anchor Walter Cronkite is supposed to have exclaimed. I thought we were winning the war. And yet, even in the face of such disillusion, popular support remained steady through March of '68. Approval of Johnson's handling of it is what plummets, what goes straight down. No consensus among Americans on what needed to be done. The broad mood was just simple agreement that the United States was hopelessly bogged down in what began to seem like an unending war. There's no doubt, I think, that Tet left Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, in a state of trouble, confusion, and uncertainty. The president and some of his top advisors believed their own rhetoric about success. They were stunned by the magnitude and suddenness of the enemy attacks. Some saw Khe Sanh as Yap's play for a repetition of the epic Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. An air of gloom hung over White House discussions, according to one participant. General Wheeler, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, likened the mood to that after First Bull Run in 1861. One sign of the mood of desperation was talk, nothing but talk, of possibly using tactical nuclear weapons at Khe Sanh if the occasion demanded it. Interestingly and significantly, I think some of the establishment figures who had created the original policy of containment of communism, the Atchisons, the Harrimans, and others, back in the Truman years, concluded during Tet that the Vietnam War had become a costly diversion, a dangerous diversion. As former Secretary of State Atchison put it, the president ought to be concerned with areas that count, by which he meant Europe. Tet obviously generates various proposals, once again, for Vietnam and broader Cold War strategy. Westmoreland wants authority to take the offensive and to finish off a weakened enemy. There's talk about 200,000 additional troops, some ways to help in Vietnam, more importantly for the Joint Chiefs to build up the strategic reserve. On the other hand, much as in late '67, civilians in the Pentagon oppose expanded bombing. Additional troops revive McNamara's proposals for shifting to a population control strategy and seeking an exit from Vietnam. News of Westmoreland's request breaks in the press in March, just as the United States and its allies face the worst economic crisis since 1929. The town is in an atmosphere of crisis, Atchison explained. Clark Clifford, the new Secretary of Defense, some of Johnson's speechwriters form a sort of cabal in the White House with the idea of doing everything they can to persuade the president to begin to de-escalate the war and negotiate his way out. The Wise Men, a group of senior figures, many of them dating back to the Truman years in World War II, who advised Johnson periodically, met in late March and reached much the same conclusion. The United States could no longer do the job we set out to do in the time we have left, and we must take steps to disengage, their report concluded. The establishment bastards have bailed out, and exhausted and dispirited, Johnson exclaimed after he received the report. Then there's the political implications. Gene McCarthy's strong showing in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy's entry into the political as an anti-war candidate. Worried party regulars plead with the president to do something exciting and dramatic to recapture the peace issue. The result of this is, of course, well known and still vividly remembered by many of us as a pivotal moment in a pivotal year. The dramatic March 31st, 1968 speech, LBJ announced that the bombing of North Vietnam would be limited to an area just north of the DMZ, would be stopped altogether if Hanoi showed restraint in infiltration. He affirmed a willingness to negotiate and appointed Harriman his special representative for negotiations. He had already rejected Westmoreland's troop request in a bombshell that stunned even his closest advisors. Those people who knew him even well didn't know when he went into the speech that he was going to do it. He announced dramatically that he would not run for re-election. So what changes after Tet and what doesn't? The best answer, I think, is that each side changed its methods while clinging to much the same goals. LBJ's speech is usually cited as a turning point in the war, and in some ways it was. No upper limit was placed on U.S. ground forces. He had the authority to resume the bombing if he wished, but the conditions under which the March decisions were made, the tone of Johnson's speech, made it unlikely that he would try under any circumstances to re-escalate the war. March 31st, 1968 just brought an end to the policy of gradual escalation that had begun back in the early 60s. To reduce U.S. casualties and quiet the home front, the administration also moved towards what would be called Vietnamization, policy of preparing Vietnamese to take over a much heavier burden of the fighting. LBJ agreed to negotiations with North Vietnam, but in doing so, he really didn't abandon or even modify his essential goal of maintaining an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. Indeed, apparent U.S. military success in Tet reinforced his conviction that the United States might be able to accomplish that goal. At the very least, he hoped to keep South Vietnam afloat until the end of his presidency. There's something to be said for an old theory that each president takes on Vietnam optimistically, gets frustrated with it, and eventually the only goal is to keep it afloat until he departs office and the next person comes in. Thus, in the wake of Tet, the United States sharply escalates the bombing in South Vietnam, and while modifying the search and destroy strategy under General Abrams, it also intensifies military operations against the enemy. LBJ's March 31st speech thus represents less a fundamental change in policy than a shift of tactics to adapt a policy that had come under fire. Hanoi also modifies its approach. The leadership was undoubtedly pleased with the impact of Tet in the United States, but there had been no insurrection in South Vietnam. The ARVN had not collapsed. The NLFF had been decimated, and the offensive had cost, at least for the short term, had cost Hanoi China's support. Even more than LBJ, Le Duan was suspicious of diplomacy. Even more than LBJ, he refused to compromise the essential goal of a unified Vietnam under Hanoi's control. Even more reluctantly than Johnson, he agreed to talks in Paris, but saw them as a way to add a diplomatic weapon to the North Vietnamese arsenal. Fighting while negotiating was the phrase they gave it. Through the summer of '68, he persists in seeking a military solution, with renewed attacks, mini Tets, the Americans call them, May and August, September. These produce once more for Hanoi no gains, huge cost. From necessity, it fell back on diplomacy as a means to gain international support and exploit growing divisions between South Vietnam and the United States. In time, it reverted to the protracted war strategy favored by Ho and Giap, scaling back attacks, keeping its main unit in sanctuaries, trying to exploit America's domestic vulnerability to secure a U.S. withdrawal. So how does the war change as a result of Tet then? In fact, quite dramatically, I think. Negotiations add a new dimension that must be taken into account when either side undertakes any initiative. In South Vietnam, the battered Viet Cong is no longer a major factor in the war politically or militarily. The brunt borne after this by North Vietnamese regulars. From this point until 1972, they are also, for the most part, are on the strategic defensive. After Tet, the U.S. home front becomes a key theater in the war. Taking any action, leaders on either side had to calculate the possible impact on American domestic politics. For this reason, Johnson and then even more Nixon shift towards what was called Vietnamization, turning over to South Vietnamese armed forces the burden of the fighting. Some South Vietnamese dismissed Vietnamization as a US dollar and Vietnamese blood-sharing plan, a fig leaf to cover American abandonment. Divisions in the United States, between the United States and South Vietnam, increased significantly after Tet. And yet, as the French philosopher told us many years ago, the more things change, the more, in some ways, they remain the same. Despite all the fighting, the heavy losses on both sides, the stalemate that Tet was designed to break persisted. Despite claims of victory, each side came out of Tet weakened in important ways. Neither had the leverage or the will to force a settlement. It would take another 4 years of fighting, more than 20,000 American lives, 107,000 South Vietnamese lives, as many as 500,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong lives before the deadlock would be broken, another 7 years before the war finally ended. The battles of Tet were thus decisive. Former Marine, Vietnam vet, distinguished historian Ronald Spector has observed, because they were so indecisive. The battles of Tet were decisive because they were indecisive. An appropriately ambiguous note to end on, I think. Thank you very much.